My neighborhood isn't what you'd call your typical movie suburb. The lawns aren't flawless, kids don't leave their bikes scattered across the sidewalks, and neighbors don't wave and smile as you drive by. Around here, people pretty much keep to themselves. Honestly, I can't recall ever having a real conversation with anyone who lives nearby. But, to be fair, this place isn't laid out like a classic neighborhood. I live in Maple Valley, and when I say valley, I mean it. The whole town's built on hills. My street is more like a roller coaster than an actual road. I'd love to tell you that you eventually get used to it, but you really don't. My house is right in the middle of a hill, and after 10 years here, I've realized I'm definitely more of a house half uphill kind of guy. My 10-year-old son, Ethan, is the opposite. He absolutely loves living here. There's a tiny single-screen movie theater just down the road, a comic book shop right next to it, an ice cream parlor across the street, and Golfland just a few blocks away. It feels like Maple Valley was designed by a kid, and honestly, Ethan's living his dream life. One day, Ethan overheard my wife and me talking about how the neighborhood felt kind of cold and unfriendly. That's when he came up with an idea to help change things. When he visits my mother-in-law, they go for walks in her neighborhood. She has a neighbor with one of those little free libraries, a small box that looks like a mailbox, filled with books. The idea is that anyone walking by can take a book or leave one for others. Ethan suggested we build one of our own and fill it with our favorite books so our neighbors could get to know us a little better. It just so happened that spring break was coming up, and I had some vacation days to burn. So I decided to take the week off and turn this into a father-son project. By the time the sun set, the library was finally finished, though, I'll admit, it took a bit longer than I'd planned. We stepped back to admire our work, proud of the little library standing tall in our yard. I handed Ethan a paintbrush and said the only thing missing now was a name. He thought about it for a moment, then started painting. When he stepped aside, I saw he'd written Hillcrest Road Library in big green letters, a perfect nod to our street. The next morning, I rolled out of bed, dragging my feet into the kitchen. Ethan was already sitting on the couch, fully dressed, shoes tied, hair brushed, and ready to go. Now, I've got a soft spot for all of Ethan's things. He's our only kid, so every little item of his feels tied to some cherished memory. I couldn't just let him toss out the books we'd read to him over the years for random strangers to take. So, I told him we'd head to the bookstore and pick out new ones for the library. Before we left, Ethan ran outside to check on the Hillcrest Road Library. I followed after him, only to see him jumping up and down, yelling, "Dad! Dad! Look!" Sure enough, there was already a book inside, waiting for us. It was an old children's book called How to Swim and Dive, published by Penguin Random House. The book had clearly been through a lot. Its once vibrant cover was protected by a clear, yellow jacket, but the spine was cracked, and the V in dive had a small tear, making it look like the title read How to Swim and Die. I couldn't help but let out a guilty laugh. The book still had a Hayward Public Library sticker on the jacket. Since Hayward's just next door, it wasn't a shock to find one of their books in our yard. What had surprised me, though, was the checkout card still inside. It listed just one borrower, Daniel Carter, who had checked it out on April 3rd, 1964. Curious, I decided to look up the name Daniel Carter online. I found a bunch of smiling young guys on Facebook and LinkedIn, but they were all way too young to be the person I was looking for. Narrowing the search to Daniel Carter, California, didn't help much either. That's when I remembered how people used to find others before the internet. I went hunting for an old Yellow Pages book. Of course, if I'd thought about it for half a second, I'd have remembered that we got rid of our last phone book at least 5 spring cleanings ago. That's when I came up with a better idea. I told Ethan we'd visit the Hayward Library. Since that's where the book came from, maybe they'd have some information on this Daniel Carter. Plus, it'd be a great chance to introduce Ethan to the wonders of a good, old-fashioned public library. Even though Ethan was practically bouncing with excitement to get inside and dive into our little investigation, he still held the library door open for an old man shuffling in behind us. The guy moved slowly, with careful, deliberate steps. I gave Ethan a quick nod of approval. The librarian, on the other hand, didn't seem quite as impressed. She peered at me over her thick glasses with a look that screamed, "Are you kidding me right now?" She let out a heavy sigh before launching into a lecture about why she couldn't share private member information, even if they still had it, which they didn't. Apparently, those records had been gone for years. Oh, and while we're at it, the yellow pages were long gone, too. I don't know why I thought the library might have one, but they didn't. So, I did what anyone else would do. I ordered a copy on my phone and had it shipped to the house. Ethan and I left empty-handed, and as we walked out, he whispered to me, "I'm gonna be a much nicer librarian at the Hillcrest Road Library." The next day turned out to be unusually warm for spring. My wife and I figured it was the perfect chance for a family trip to the community pool. We didn't have a pool at home, and neither did anyone we knew. So this was the next best thing. Ethan wasn't exactly a natural in the water, but luckily for him, we now had a trusty how-to-swim book in our possession. When we got to the pool, I was tasked with the all-important mission of finding us some pool chairs. It took a little longer than I'd hoped, but an older gentleman wearing a bucket hat and oversized sunglasses noticed my struggle and offered up his chair before heading out. "I had that same book when I was a kid," he said, giving me the faintest smile as he tipped his hat and walked away. Once I got settled, I started flipping through the book, trying to find some useful tips to share with Ethan. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Numbers, neatly handwritten in the bottom corners of every single page. 2 numbers on each page, and they didn't match the page numbers at all. The first page had 37, the second had 66, then 46, and so on. There were 15 sets of numbers in total, but I couldn't make sense of any kind of pattern. Now, I'm not ashamed to admit that my wife is the smarter one between the two of us. Still, it stung a little when she took one quick glance at the book and immediately said, "Oh, neat. They're coordinates." Of course. Why hadn't I thought of that? Ethan, wide-eyed, asked what coordinates were. When I explained, his imagination went straight to buried treasure. He was already plotting how we could find it, but I had to shoot down his grand adventure for the day. "We'll go check it out tomorrow," I told him, then promptly hit the biggest cannonball he'd ever seen to distract him. The next morning, Ethan woke me up by shaking my shoulder like his life depended on it. He didn't stop until I had Google Maps open on my phone. He hovered over me, watching every move as I typed in each number from the book. When the pin finally dropped, it landed in a cluster of trees near the Ward Creek Trail in the Hayward Hills. Ethan couldn't believe it. It was only a 10-minute drive from home. Ethan was buzzing with excitement as we walked along the trail. Normally, he's not the type to chat with strangers, but that day, he was saying hi to everyone. He waved at a family walking their dog, greeted a jogger with a high five, and even told an older man resting on a bench to have a great day. As we got closer to the coordinates, the trail narrowed, and it became clear we'd have to veer off into the woods. It didn't look like the safest trek for a 10-year-old, and for a second, I thought about calling it off. But seeing the determination in Ethan's face, I couldn't bring myself to do it. When we were almost there, I started noticing flashes of color in the distance. For a moment, I thought it might be a group of people. I instinctively stepped in front of Ethan, sliding him behind me as we moved closer to see what was waiting for us. Standing right on top of the coordinates, we were smack in the middle of a group of trees. Each tree had a t-shirt nailed to it, creating a sort of circle around us. The shirts were small, like they'd fit Ethan. There were 6 in total. They were old, ringer-style shirts with red trim and the words Maple Valley Plunge written in red font. I could barely make out the names on the inside tags: John, Henry, Susie, Wayne, Donna, and Jackie. I had no clue what Maple Valley Plunge meant or who those names belonged to, but honestly, that didn't matter. I was starting to panic. My instincts kicked in. I was ready to bolt. This wasn't the harmless treasure hunt I thought it would be. It was wrong, way wrong. I should have never brought Ethan here. I've seen enough of this stuff on old crime shows to know that those shirts weren't just shirts. They looked like something you'd find with bloodstains. I didn't want Ethan to see the panic on my face, and I knew he was about to ask if we could start digging for treasure. I had to get him out of there fast. I tried to fake some excitement and said we should celebrate reaching the end of the hunt. Told him we deserved some ice cream for all our hard work. He wasn't ready to leave until I promised he could get as many scoops and toppings as he wanted. That did the trick. I thought a good night's sleep would help me forget about the shirts nailed to the trees, but it didn't. They stayed with me all through the night. As I got out of bed and made my coffee, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Even when I was standing by the front window watching Ethan play outside, I couldn't shake the feeling. I saw him looking under rocks for bugs, lying in the grass, and finally checking the Hillcrest Road Library. Then he ran inside, holding a stack of books. He proudly laid them out, and my stomach dropped when I realized they were more of those vintage books. The kind with art and colors from another time. Titles like The Clumsy Cowboy and Hurry Up, Slowpoke. I leaned over to take a peek as he flipped through one. Inside the cover, it said, "This book belongs to," with Wayne written under it. For the last day, those 6 names had been running through my head on repeat. Wayne was one of them. I grabbed another book, opened it, and sure enough, it said, Susie. I didn't need to open more, but I did anyway. One by one, I found the same thing: John, Jackie, Henry, and finally Donna. At this point, I was ready to rip the Hillcrest Road Library right out of the ground. I went through my Ring notifications. Since we set up the library, it seemed like everyone in Maple Valley stopped by to check it out. I had hundreds of clips of people in front of it. It could have been any of them. I went through each clip, trying to figure out who dropped the books off. The problem was, the camera couldn't catch if someone was taking or leaving books. Honestly, that made me suspicious of everyone. Was it the dad with his kids? The moms with strollers? The dog walkers? The mailman? I gave up the search and set my phone on my lap while the clips kept playing. At that point, I was really losing it. I wasn't sure why this was bothering me so much. It wasn't like someone was putting inappropriate stuff in the library. No one was breaking any laws. It was just off. Creepy. Even. I started to wonder if it was some kind of elaborate prank. I told myself it was just that and tried to move on. But when I picked up my phone again, the video was already playing. There was no one in front of the Hillcrest Road Library or even near our house. I was confused as to why it had recorded. Then, in the corner of the frame, I saw an old man standing across the street, just staring at the library. He stood there for what felt like forever before turning and walking away. The video was grainy, and he was so far away I couldn't make out his face. But it felt strange, and that made me more determined than ever to figure this out, just so I could feel like my family was safe at home. I tried to gather all the info I had: the books, the names, the year on the library card, the coordinates, and those blood-stained shirts on the trees. The shirts had the words Maple Valley Plunge on them. I typed that phrase into a search bar, and the first result was a link to the Maple Valley Parks and Rec website. Next to it was a small collage showing a map, street view, and a picture of the inside of a building. Built in 1936, the Maple Valley Plunge was an indoor swimming pool, kind of like a big pool inside a hangar. And as I looked at the map, I realized the trail I had just walked on the other day ran right behind the building. Finally, everything started to come together. I was waiting at the front desk when the teenager working there went off to find the manager. I felt kind of silly, but there was no way I could just let this go. When the manager came over, she asked how she could help. I took a deep breath and dove right in. I explained how I ended up with Daniel Carter's swim book, how it led me to the trail, and then to the shirts with Maple Valley Plunge on them. I had no idea what I was expecting, but I certainly didn't expect the manager's face to go pale. She paused for a second, then asked, "Could we talk in my office?" I sat down across from her at the desk. She didn't waste any time. She said, "Back in the day, there was a beginner swimming class. A few kids went missing. That was enough to send a chill down my spine, but she kept going. This was in the 60s, so they didn't have cameras or anything like that. The Maple Valley Police didn't have any evidence of who took the kids or where they went." I didn't know what to say. I didn't have to say anything, though, because she wasn't done. She took a breath, gathering strength before she said, "It's kind of an urban legend around here, so take it with a grain of salt, but people say the swim instructor had something to do with it." I saw it in her eyes before the words even came out. I knew what was coming next. She looked me square in the eye and said, "The instructor. His name was Roger." My head was spinning, but it didn't stop while I drove home. What did I bring into my home? What kind of danger had I put my son in? Who was Roger Davis? That last question would be answered sooner than I thought. At our front door, waiting for me, was the giant waste of paper that is the Yellow Pages. It made a loud thud when I set it on the kitchen table to grab a beer. I swear it was staring at me the whole time, begging me to open it. I knew I had to, but I didn't want to. I was fed up with this whole situation. It had gone far beyond what I was prepared for. I stared at the Yellow Pages. It just sat there, silent. I took a swig of beer and thought, screw it. I flipped through the resident section and found the D's. It didn't take long to spot the first Davis. A page over, near the bottom, Roger M. Davis. I should have stopped right there. I had his name. I could have walked away. I found him, mission accomplished. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to know more. I scanned to the right, where his address was listed. The beer nearly came back up as I read it. Under current address was Green Ridge Road. The scariest house isn't always the one that looks it. It's not the one with a rundown lawn or the shady-looking folks who avoid eye contact. Sometimes it's the house that's painted in the friendliest shade of soft yellow. The one with the American flag flying just right from the porch. The one where the old man comes out like clockwork to water his lawn. The one you'd feel fine sending your kid to for Halloween candy. What's the saying about judging books by their cover? Roger Davis was arrested for the murders of John and Jackie Miller, ages 9 and 8, Donna Zimmerman, age 7, Wayne Jackson, age 8, Susie Lee, age 8, and Henry Parker, age 6, almost 60 years after the crimes. He was 86 when they arrested him. I gave the police everything I had. They used fingerprints from Henry Parker's copy of The Rise and Fall of Ben Gizzard, found in our library, to match with some of his belongings his mother had kept all these years. Roger's prints were also found on the kids' books, including the How to Swim and Dive manual from our library. Cadaver dogs were brought in to search the area near the coordinates, and they were able to recover the remains of all 6 children. I still feel sick and ashamed knowing that I brought my son to the exact spot where those kids were buried. I let him stand over their bones, playing some dumb pretend scavenger hunt. Weeks later, we were having dinner when I heard the sirens. Flashing lights bounced off the walls. Our street doesn't get much police action, so I knew who they were here for. It took me a few minutes to walk down my street to the house covered in crime scene tape. 2 officers were leading a hunched, white-haired man out in handcuffs. He looked fragile, confused, and like any other elderly man you'd see around here. Nothing about him screamed, "Murderer." But that didn't matter. The cops shut the squad car door behind him, and it was done. I watched him in the back seat of the cop car. He didn't move, just stared at nothing in front of him for what felt like an eternity. One of the officers told me they couldn't share any details about the case, not realizing I was the one who had brought all 6 cold cases back to life. I didn't have much left to see, so I turned to head back home. Before I left, I glanced one more time at Roger. I needed to burn his face into my memory to make sure I'd never forget what evil looked like, so I'd never let my son get close to it again. For a few seconds, nothing happened. But then, slowly, Roger turned his whole body toward me. His face was empty, no sign of humanity left in him. He locked eyes with me. I could see just the faintest flicker of recognition in his expression. I didn't want to look away. I wasn't going to let him see fear in my eyes, even though I was terrified inside. Just before the car pulled away, I saw his mouth form a sick, perverted grin. It was small, but it was there. I knew he wasn't smiling because of the arrest. He was smiling because he knew he'd gotten away with it, and he was about to die a free man. But that's not what made him smile. He smiled because he knew I'd see him again. Every time someone left a book in the Hillcrest Road Library for Ethan. Every time Ethan's baseball coach pulled him aside to give him tips on his swing. Every parent-teacher conference. Every interaction with someone I trusted around my son. He knew that's how he would live on. As I stood there, watching the police car pull away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Even though Roger was in the back of that squad car, I felt his presence like a shadow creeping behind me. The air was thick with a sense of unease, like the calm before the storm. The reality of what I had just uncovered was starting to settle in, and the weight of it made my chest tight. I turned back to the house, my mind racing with thoughts of Ethan. How had I missed all the signs? How had I unknowingly led him into danger? I tried to push the guilt away, but it clung to me, a heavy cloak I couldn't shed. I needed to protect him. It wasn't just about keeping him away from the dangers of the world. It was about keeping him from the horrors that could hide in plain sight. The house felt emptier than usual when I stepped inside. Ethan was still out in the front yard, his laughter cutting through the stillness as he ran around, completely unaware of the darkness that had been lurking just around the corner. I watched him for a moment, trying to keep the anxiety from rising in my chest. I had to keep it together for him. I closed the door quietly behind me and headed straight for the kitchen. My hands were shaking as I poured myself another beer, trying to steady myself. I needed to think clearly, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw Roger's cold, lifeless stare and that sickening grin. I ran a hand through my hair and stared out the window at Ethan. He was playing with a toy truck now, making vroom vroom sounds as he zoomed it across the grass. He was so innocent, so unaware of the twisted history of this place, of how close he had come to becoming another name on a list that should never exist. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Roger Davis was just one piece of the puzzle, and I had no idea what the rest looked like. Who else was involved? Who else knew about the missing kids, the twisted stories, the strange coincidences that led me here? I grabbed my phone again and started scrolling through old news articles, trying to make sense of the trail that had been buried for decades. There had to be more to the story. I couldn't stop now. I owed it to the kids who never got the chance to grow up. I owed it to Ethan. As the evening wore on, I found myself researching the same names over and over again. John, Jackie, Donna, Wayne, Susie, and Henry. Every article, every snippet of information felt like a dead end. But there was something gnawing at me, a sense that the pieces were all connected in ways I couldn't yet understand. Finally, I stumbled across something that made my blood run cold. It was a brief mention in a local forum from a few years back. A retired police officer, speaking anonymously, claimed that the real story behind the Hayward plunge had never been fully uncovered. He hinted at a cover-up, a group of people who had been involved in the disappearances, and how it all tied back to Roger Davis and a handful of others. My heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the missing piece. But I knew better than to get ahead of myself. There was no way I was going to walk into another dead end, not after everything I'd already uncovered. I bookmarked the page and sat back, letting out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The world outside felt still, like everything had stopped for just a moment, holding its breath. It was almost like the calm after the storm. Just before the next wave hit, I needed to be ready. Whatever came next, whatever truth I had yet to uncover, I had to be prepared. For Ethan, for the kids who never made it out, and for myself, because there was no turning back now. I stood up and walked over to the window again, watching Ethan as he looked up at the sky. The sun was starting to set, casting a golden glow over everything. I watched him for a moment longer, then made my decision. This wasn't just about finding answers anymore. This was about protecting the people I loved, and I wasn't going to let Roger Davis or anyone else hurt them again.